in the shadowy heart of medieval Europe, where faith shaped kings and fear filled the hearts of peasants. One throne ruled above all others, not of iron, but of gold. It was not a king who sat upon it, but a man who claimed to speak for God himself. Clothed in silk, crowned in jewels, and guarded by whispers, the papacy was seen as the holiest office in the known world. But behind its polished altars, behind the perfume of incense and the flutter of dove-white robes, there lurked a world far less divine. A world of corruption, of secret mistresses and bastard sons, of poison in chalices and daggers beneath vestments, of power abused in candlelit chambers where sins were forgiven or paid for in gold. This is not the history written in hymn books. This is the other side, the scandalous side. So close your eyes, lie back, and prepare to wander through the forgotten corridors of the Vatican's darkest centuries, where even the holiest men sometimes sin the loudest. It was the year 955, and Rome was not the sacred city it once claimed to be. The streets were filled with unrest. The noble families waged silent wars for influence. And in the midst of it all, a boy was chosen to wear the papal crown. His name was Octavianus. Just 18 years old, he would take the name Pope John XII. To the people, he was God's chosen vessel on earth. But behind the palace doors, he was still a teenager, impulsive, arrogant, and dangerously powerful. Raised among Roman nobility, Octavian was used to luxury. His father, a wealthy and influential patrician, ensured his election through bribes and intimidation. The clergy bowed, the people watched, and Octavian was crowned the vicar of Christ. But instead of guiding souls, he chased desires. Inside the Lateran Palace, once the sacred seat of church authority, Pope John XII turned the holy chambers into a playground of lust and excess. Witnesses described feasts that lasted for days, where the finest wine flowed freely, and the Pope himself would gamble, drink, and cavort with mistresses, even inside the basilica. It was whispered that he kept concubines within the palace, and that sacred relics were sold off to fund his indulgences. Some claimed he invoked pagan gods during rituals, that he turned the Lateran into a brothel, and that even his own relatives weren't safe from his hunger for control. But sin breeds enemies. When Pope John XII dared to betray the German Emperor Otto I, allying with his enemies and plotting in the shadows, Otto descended upon Rome with an army. The emperor called a council, and the charges laid against the Pope were staggering: murder, arson, simony, perjury, even incest. The holy men gasped. But John? He fled the city, leaving his throne empty. For a time, another was elected in his place. But John returned with armed allies, retook Rome, and mutilated his enemies, reportedly cutting off noses, tongues, and hands. Yet his reign would not last. One quiet night in 964 AD, as he lay in bed with a married woman, he suffered a violent stroke. Others claimed it wasn't natural. They whispered that he'd been beaten to death by the woman's enraged husband, the details murky, shrouded in Vatican silence. John XII died the way he lived, in scandal, shadow, and sin. He was buried without ceremony, his name quietly removed from many records. But the memory of the boy pope who treated the papacy like a personal palace never truly faded. And he was only the beginning. If you thought a teenage pope was unsettling, wait until you learn about the time when women ruled the papacy from behind velvet curtains and locked chamber doors. Historians call this strange and shadowy era the Saeculum Obscurum, the Dark Age. But others gave it a more scandalous name: the Pornocracy, the rule of the harlots. The story begins with a woman named Theodora, a Roman noblewoman, charming, intelligent, and dangerously influential. But the true puppet master was her daughter, Marozia. Marozia wasn't content with marriage or wealth. She wanted control of the most sacred seat in the world. And she would get it, not by war, but by bedroom diplomacy. Through a series of affairs, secret marriages, and whispered alliances, Marozia gained control of the papal throne itself. She didn't sit on it, of course. She simply chose who did. Her first lover? Pope Sergius III. Together, they had a son, And years later, that very son would become Pope John the 11th. Imagine it, the Pope, quite literally, the son of a Pope and his mistress. Marozia ruled Rome from the shadows, pulling strings like a master puppeteer. She placed popes, removed popes, and even had some imprisoned or murdered when they disobeyed. No one challenged her. No one dared. Some whispered she even crowned herself senatrix of Rome, wielding more power than emperors. But every reign eventually meets its end. Marozia made one fatal mistake. She remarried. Her new husband was ambitious and foolish. He challenged a powerful rival, King Alberic II, who also happened to be Marozia's own son from a previous marriage. Yes, her other son. Family ties meant nothing in the blood-slicked streets of medieval Rome. Alberic stormed the city, overthrew the palace, and threw Marozia into a cold, damp prison, where she would rot for the rest of her life. Her power gone, her whispers silenced. The papacy stumbled onward, but the stain remained. For over 60 years, popes rose and fell, not because of faith or merit, but because of lust, family, and politics. And the church? It said nothing, because it was under the thumb of Rome's ruling families and their dangerous daughters. The holy city had become a puppet show, and no one knew who would pull the strings next. In the long and winding history of the papacy, there has been only one man who held the title of Pope not once, not twice, but 3 separate times. His name was Benedict IX, and his legacy is not one of holiness, but of scandal, greed, and the unthinkable sale of the papal throne. He was born into power, a member of the powerful Tusculani family, a clan that treated the papacy like a family business. They didn't just influence Rome, they owned it. So it came as no surprise when, around 1032, the church named their youngest member, just 20 years old, as pope. Though some whisper he was even younger. Imagine it, a boy, barely out of adolescence, handed the keys to Christendom. And what did young Benedict do? He turned the Vatican into a personal playground. Orgies, bribery, violence, all behind the sacred altar. Even other clergymen, known for their silence, called his behavior a disgrace to the chair of St. Peter. But power is a fickle friend. Benedict was forced out of Rome, chased by revolts and riots, only to return again with armed support and reclaim his stolen seat. Not once, but twice. Like a ghost of corruption, he reappeared again and again. Eventually, though, even Benedict grew tired. He no longer desired the throne, only the wealth and comfort it brought. So in a move that would shock the ages, he sold the papacy. He sold the title of pope to his own godfather, no less, a respected priest named John Gratian, who became Pope Gregory VI. The price? 1,000 pounds of silver. The church, supposedly incorruptible, had been reduced to a marketplace. And the highest bidder was now the Holy Father. But of course, nothing is simple in Rome. 3 men began to claim they were the true pope, Benedict, his godfather Gregory, and a third candidate, Pope Sylvester III. It became chaos. A 3-headed church. A spiritual civil war. Eventually, an emperor intervened. All 3 were forced to step down. And Benedict? He vanished into the countryside, excommunicated and disgraced. His name removed from prayer. His soul considered lost. But in the dark corners of Rome's memory, his story still lingers. The Pope who sold the throne of St. Peter like it was a wine barrel in a tavern. Music softens, sound of coins dropping faintly, echoing in the distance. Narrator, gently. And as we turn the page, we find that even exile is not the end. For the scandals were just beginning. For centuries, the Pope was the Bishop of Rome, the holy shepherd seated within the heart of Christendom. But in the 14th century, something changed. Rome became too dangerous, too unstable, too Roman. And so, the papacy did something unthinkable. It packed its bags and left. Where did it go? Not Jerusalem, not Constantinople, but Avignon, a quiet, picturesque town in the south of France. In 1309, Pope Clement V, pressured by the French crown, made his way across the Alps and set up his throne on foreign soil. What began as a temporary arrangement would last nearly 70 years. And during those years, the papacy flourished, but not in spirit, in splendor. The Avignon popes didn't live like humble servants of God. They lived like monarchs. Lavish banquets under golden chandeliers. Palaces that echoed with laughter, not prayer. Bureaucracies that charged fees for blessings, indulgences, even pardons. These were the Babylonian captivity years of the Church, as one poet called them, when the Pope was held hostage by French kings. 7 popes would rule from Avignon, each one more deeply entangled in French politics, each one more distant from Rome's crumbling basilicas. And the people noticed. Pilgrims no longer flocked to St. Peter's tomb. Rome became a ghost of its sacred past. And whispers began to stir. Was this still God's church? Or had the Holy Throne become just another French court? In 1377, after decades of exile, one man dared to return. Pope Gregory XI stepped back into the ancient halls of Rome, bringing the papacy home. But he would not live long. And after his death, the church shattered. 2 factions formed, one in Rome, one in Avignon. And for the first time in history, 2 men claimed to be pope. Each declared the other a heretic. Each excommunicated the other. Europe was torn in 2. Kings and kingdoms chose sides. Priests were caught in the middle. And the faithful? They no longer knew who spoke for God. The Avignon exile had ended, but it had left the church divided, wounded, and drowning in confusion. The throne had returned to Rome, but the cracks in its foundation had begun to show. The world would witness the greatest embarrassment of all, a time when there were not 1, not 2, but 3 popes at the same time. Imagine walking into a church in the year 1400, kneeling to pray, and realizing you don't know who the real pope is. Not because of doubt, but because there are 3 men, all claiming to be the true vicar of Christ. This was the Western Schism, a decades-long crisis that nearly broke the Catholic Church in 2. It all began after the papacy's long return from Avignon. Rome had its pope again, but not everyone agreed with the choice. In 1378, when Pope Gregory XI died, a new man was elected, Urban VI. He was Italian, loud, impulsive, and unkind to the cardinals who had chosen him. Fearing they'd made a mistake, a group of cardinals declared his election invalid, claiming they'd been pressured by Roman mobs. So, they held another conclave and elected a second pope, Clement VII, who returned to, you guessed it, Avignon. 2 popes, 2 papal courts, 2 sets of loyal followers, kings, bishops, and priests, each forced to pick a side. France, Scotland, and Spain supported the Avignon pope. England, Germany, and much of Italy sided with the Roman pope. Each pope excommunicated the other. Each claimed to hold the keys to heaven. And the faithful? They were trapped. If you followed the wrong pope, were your sins still forgiven? Was your marriage still valid? Had your soul been abandoned? For years, the church lived in this unbearable tension. And then it got worse. In 1409, in an effort to end the chaos, church leaders called a grand council at Pisa. They declared both popes deposed and elected a third, Pope Alexander V. But neither of the original 2 stepped down. So 3 popes, each claiming to be the only true successor of St. Peter. The church was paralyzed. Priests were uncertain. Kings were embarrassed. And the faithful? They were exhausted. Finally, in 1414, a final council was summoned, the Council of Constance. 3 years of arguing, negotiating, praying, and finally, resolution. 1 pope resigned. 1 was deposed. The 3rd ignored. In 1417, the church elected Pope Martin V, restoring unity at last. The schism had lasted nearly 40 years. An entire generation had grown up not knowing who their true spiritual leader was. The throne was whole again, but the cracks remained. And as the church tried to heal, a storm was already brewing beyond the cathedral walls. A monk in Germany, a hammer, and a door. But that's a story for another night. In the heart of the Renaissance, when art flourished and palaces gleamed with marble and gold, The papacy fell into its darkest shadow. This is the story of Rodrigo Borgia, a man whose name became synonymous with corruption, poison, and power. In 1492, the same year Columbus set sail for the New World, the cardinals of Rome gathered to elect a new pope. Bribes flowed like wine. Votes were bought with gold, land, and promises of titles. And when the smoke cleared, Rodrigo Borgia stood as Pope Alexander VI. He was no humble servant of God. He was a cunning politician and a ruthless patriarch of a powerful dynasty. And the Vatican? It became his castle. Alexander VI had mistresses, even as Pope. He fathered multiple children, the most infamous being Cesare Borgia, a man of ambition, steel, and blood, and Lucrezia Borgia, the daughter whispered to wield beauty as her deadliest weapon. Together, the Borgia family turned the church into a throne of family empire. Enemies were eliminated, some by exile, some by dagger, some, it said, by poisoned wine. Banquets were held in the shadow of crucifixes. Tapestries hung in the papal halls depicted not saints, but power. It was whispered that Cesare, once a cardinal himself, had killed his own brother, out of jealousy for Lucrezia's affections. And Lucrezia? They said she wore a ring with a hidden compartment, to slip poison into the goblets of dinner guests. But whether myth or truth, no one dared ask. Not in a Rome ruled by the Borgias. Even their enemies admitted it. They were brilliant, strategic, and terrifying. Alexander VI orchestrated marriages for Lucrezia that sealed political alliances across Italy. He raised Cesare from cardinal to military commander, giving him control over papal armies. The Pope became more king than priest, more Caesar than saint. And then, just as suddenly as his rise, came his fall. In 1503, during another lavish feast, Alexander VI fell violently ill. Some say it was malaria. Others claim it was a poisoned chalice meant for someone else, that he accidentally drank. His skin blackened. He died in agony. And when it came time to bury him, the church was silent. No great mourning. No celebration of sainthood. Only shadows. And silence. The Borgia name faded from history. But the memory of their reign lingers still. In portraits, in whispers, and in the dark corners of Rome. By the time Giovanni de' Medici became Pope Leo X in 1513, the church was no longer just a spiritual guide. It was an empire of wealth, art, and marble. And Leo? He was born into it. He came from the powerful Medici family of Florence, the same family that ruled with gold-laced fingers, patronized Michelangelo, and practically purchased culture itself. At the age of 13, Giovanni had already been made a cardinal. Not for piety, but for pedigree. And when he finally ascended the throne of St. Peter as Pope Leo X, he made one thing clear. Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it. And enjoy it he did. Under Leo X, the Vatican became a theater of excess. He hosted massive banquets, entertained foreign dignitaries with plays and fireworks, and poured vast fortunes into commissioning art and architecture. The very ceilings of Rome glittered under his reign, gilded with gold, painted with divine scenes. St. Peter's Basilica, the great symbol of Christendom, was rising higher than ever. But beauty, as always, came at a cost. The church coffers began to bleed. And to refill them, Leo turned to something that would become his most catastrophic mistake: indulgences. These were once simple prayers or pilgrimages to reduce punishment for sins. But under Leo, they became a financial tool. Forgiveness could be bought. Salvation could be sold. As long as the gold kept flowing, sins could be wiped away like chalk from a board. Priests traveled across Europe selling indulgence papers like carnival barkers. One even declared, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." It worked. The Vatican's gold returned. But so did something else. In the cold halls of a German monastery, a monk named Martin Luther watched this unfold. Outraged, he picked up his pen. In 1517, he nailed 95 theses to the church door in Wittenberg. Not a declaration of war, but a call for reform. Leo didn't take it seriously. A nuisance, he thought. A mosquito buzzing in the candlelight. But this mosquito would spark a wildfire. Luther's writings spread across Europe like ink spilled across a map. People began to question, to protest, to split away. Protestants were born, and the once unshakable throne of the papacy began to tremble. Leo died in 1521, still wrapped in velvet and surrounded by opulence. He never saw the revolution fully unfold. But the world had changed. All it took was a pen, and a pope who loved pleasure, a little too much. Not all popes ruled from the shadows of palaces. Some rode into battle, and none wore the armor of power more literally than Pope Julius II, known to history as the warrior pope. Before he became pope in 1503, he was Giuliano della Rovere, a man of ambition, fire, and towering presence. He was not gentle, not scholarly, not even particularly religious. He was a general, in silk robes, and sometimes in plate armor. And when he became pope, he ruled not just with parchment, but with the sword. He charged into wars, not prayers. He led armies on horseback. He wore a breastplate marked not with crosses, but with battle scars. His dream? To restore and expand the papal states, the earthly kingdom of the Church in central Italy. For Julius, faith was not just belief, it was power, and Rome, under his rule, would become a fortress. He waged wars against city-states, noble families, even fellow Christians. One year, he personally laid siege to Bologna, riding at the front of his troops, a pope commanding cannons. He didn't shrink from the mud or the cold. Soldiers described him as relentless, a man who would kneel to no one, not even to God. And yet, while the fields burned with war, something else rose quietly behind the Vatican walls. Michelangelo. It was Julius who commissioned the Sistine Chapel ceiling, that sprawling, breathtaking masterpiece of color and divinity. But the process was anything but holy. Julius would storm in, demanding progress. He threatened the artist, cursed in Latin, and even withheld payment. He wanted glory, on canvas and on battlefields. And when he wasn't fighting wars, he was fighting corruption. He convened councils, dismissed cardinals, tried to purify the church, though some said he simply wanted obedience, not virtue. Still, Julius left a legacy carved in stone. Under his watch, St. Peter's Basilica began its transformation into the magnificent structure we know today. But war has a cost. Rome's streets were quiet, its people exhausted, and the spiritual heart of Christendom beat like a war drum. When Julius died in 1513, the church exhaled. Some praised his courage. Others whispered that he had been more Caesar than saint. He was the pope who fought battles instead of demons, who commissioned heaven on the ceiling, while waging war on earth. And in the church's long memory, his shadow still stands, not in robes, but in iron. Of all the scandals in papal history, none are quite as haunting as the Cadaver Synod. It happened in the year 897, a time of chaos, betrayal, and shifting thrones in the early medieval church. And at the center of it all was Pope Stephen VI, a man so consumed by hatred that he put a dead pope on trial. A corpse. It began with Pope Formosus, who had died the year before. Formosus had made enemies in life, powerful ones. Some questioned his legitimacy, others despised the bishops he had appointed. And among his fiercest rivals was the man who would become Stephen VI. Most men let their grudges die with their enemies. But Stephen did not. When he became pope, he ordered that Formosus's corpse be exhumed, dug up from its tomb 9 months after burial. His body, rotted and skeletal, still dressed in papal robes, was placed on a throne in a courtroom. Witnesses say his head lolled to one side. His fingers were black and brittle. He could not speak, but that didn't stop the trial. Stephen himself acted as judge, jury, and accuser. He screamed at the dead pope, accusing him of seizing the papacy unlawfully, of violating canon law, of daring to serve as bishop in 2 places. A deacon was appointed to speak for the corpse, raising the skeletal hand in mock gestures. Some say the crowd laughed. Others say they cried. The trial ended in predictable horror. Formosus was found guilty. His papal acts were declared void. And worse, Stephen ordered that 3 fingers on Formosus's right hand, the ones used to give blessings, be cut off. His body was stripped of robes, dragged through the streets, and then thrown into the Tiber River. For weeks afterward, rumors spread. The river rose. Thunder rolled over Rome. Some said the dead pope cursed those who had defiled him. Others claimed his body washed ashore and began performing miracles. But retribution came swiftly, not from above, but from the people. The spectacle had gone too far. Within months, Stephen VI was arrested, imprisoned, and later found strangled in his cell. No trial, no ceremony, just silence. A deep hush, then the gentle drip of water in a dark stone chamber. Narrator, softly. It remains one of the strangest, most grotesque events in papal history. The Pope putting another pope's corpse on trial. And though the tombs have long closed, the memory of that dark spectacle still echoes through the stone halls of the Vatican, like footsteps that never should have been. The Vatican stands tall tonight, its marble floors polished by centuries of footsteps, its domes reflecting moonlight and memory. But listen closely, and you might still hear the whispers of warhorses clattering across cobblestones, of ink-stained hands nailing truths to old doors, of laughter from forbidden banquets behind chapel walls, and of judgment passed on the long dead in candlelit courtrooms. The stories we've told tonight, of popes who waged wars, who bartered indulgences, who exhumed their enemies, and wore armor into battle, they seem like fiction, but they are not. They are real, etched into the dusty scrolls of history, painted onto chapel ceilings, and carved into cold tombstones beneath cathedral floors. For all their holy titles, these men were still men, shaped by power, pride, fear, and desire. They prayed, yes, but they also plotted. They blessed, but some cursed. And the church, that grand, towering institution, somehow endured. It survived poison and politics, gold and heresy, crowns and revolution. Because history is not just the record of saints and sinners. It is the long, winding sleepwalk of humanity, across battlefields and altars alike. So as you close your eyes tonight, know this: the past never truly sleeps. It murmurs quietly in the marble halls of Rome, waiting to be heard again, not to frighten, but to remind. That power always comes with shadow, and truth, however slow, always finds a way to rise. Even from a tomb. Good night. From the pages of history. Until next time.